everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be talking about optics in airsoft. It's a topic that we've talked about in the past, both magnified optics, red dots, and so on. I'm going to be rehashing it today as a result of some new information, some new experiences that we've had over the last couple of months. But before we dive in, I want to give you a very important update on Bill C-21 involving airsoft in Canada. So I'm not going to rehash the intro of Bill C-21. If you have been listening to this podcast, you know what I'm talking about. But what's happened most recently is that on October 4th, the SECU committee, which is the committee that is reviewing the Bill C-21 and the legislation, the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, met for the first time to discuss Bill C-21. And during that meeting, one of the people who spoke about the current status of C-21 as it relates to airsoft was the Assistant Deputy Minister to the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Talal Dakelbab. And so Mr. Dakelbab had a really interesting point of information to provide in that he said that he had received a tremendous amount of letters, emails, briefs from members of the airsoft community, and that it was something that he was hearing a lot about, which is a very positive thing. Obviously, people did heed our messages, write their members of parliament, write the different ministers who are involved in this. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, democracy in action in a very literal sense. Quite
literally, yeah. The other really great thing that he mentioned is that he was asked at what point he would be able to make a recommendation to the minister with respect to airsoft in particular. And two things came out of that. The first thing is that he mentioned that the portion that relates to airsoft takes effect as soon as the law comes into force, which means that his recommendations to the minister have to be in place before the law can be voted on. So that's a really good thing. That means that airsoft is not going to exist in this gray area, legal area like it has in the past. We will have a decision as soon as the law comes into effect. The other great thing that they mentioned is that, Mr. Dakelbab mentioned in particular that they had been looking at what was done for airsoft in different countries, including the United Kingdom, which he described as a very good system, quote unquote. So that's a really good piece of information as well. That means that not only are they going to be making recommendations to the minister before the law is voted on, but they're also looking at what's already being done around the world, which is great because that's one of the things we wanted them to be doing, not making this decision for Canada in isolation, but, looking more broadly. So that's what happened on October 4th. What's going to happen tomorrow, as the date of this recording, October 18th, is the second meeting of the SECU talking about Bill C-21. And in particular, at this meeting, they will be having witnesses from the airsoft community throughout the country. In particular, they will have members from the Airsoft in Canada, which is the savingairsoft.ca webpage, including Brian McIlmoy, who's the director of Airsoft in Canada, as well as one of the directors at TAC3 in Toronto, as well as Ziming Wang, who is probably the most well-known gun tech in Canada at time of recording, as well as members of the Fédération Sportive d'Airsoft du Québec. So two people who are joining by video conference. Meanwhile, the three other people from Airsoft in Canada, so Brian McIlmoy, Nicholas James Martin, and Ziming Wang, will be appearing in person at the committee, which, again, bodes very well. Finally, one of the things that was requested and typically happens for this type of review on the committee stage is they receive briefs from different people who are involved in whatever the topic at hand is. And a brief is basically a write-up explaining who you are, where you work, what your age is, what your involvement is in the community, and the impact that would have on you and what you're asking to be reviewed. And Airsoft in Canada provided a really good template for people to submit their own briefs. And what's really, really cool is that they received, many different briefs, but they have selected 7 different briefs from airsoft players, members of the community, airsoft businesses, as well as airsoft teams to present to the committee as part of their review of Bill C-21. So They didn't pick my brief, by the way. I think I did a pretty good one, but there's another one from the Cats Airsoft team. Cats Airsoft team being one of the teams located out west. Very big team. They've been involved in airsoft since about, I believe, 2012. So, not much younger than us, but still. So this is really good. And what this tells us as airsofters is that the plight of the airsofter in Canada, as it relates to Bill C-21, is not being ignored. Our voice is very much being heard at this committee stage, and this is giving us the maximum chance to make a positive impact on Bill C-21 in particular, and make sure that we continue playing airsoft in future. Now, does this mean that the threat is off the table? Does this mean that airsoft is not still going to get banned? No, it doesn't. But what it does mean is that as an airsoft community, we have exercised our democratic privilege of being able to speak our voice, connect with our members of parliament, engage in the democratic system, and make sure that whatever decision is made, we will have done the very best that we can to make sure that our voices are heard. Now, we do live in a democracy, and that means that people may not agree with us, and that's okay. But the very, very least we can do is make sure that we engage, and I can't be more satisfied with what we've done so far as an airsoft community across our country. So we'll have an update for you on what gets said at the next session. Hopefully, we'll have a bit more information than we have today. We do have our 100th podcast episode coming up, and what a great way to celebrate 100 episodes of this podcast than by telling you that everything is free and clear and airsoft is going to be safe. I highly doubt that's going to happen, but one can hope.
We can hope. Yeah, it would be nice for sure.
Yeah. So with that being said, let's move on past Bill C-21 and let's start talking about the topic of the day, which is airsoft optics, and in particular, magnified optics. And, well, to be frank, how I have been very vocal against magnified optics in the past. And I think based on my experience, I don't think that that's unfair. However, I had recently a very good experience, and we want to talk through it and show you that what we talk about when we say, always reviewing the kit that we use, checking what we think our assumptions are about how things do and don't work for us, is very true, right?
Yeah.
So
definitely.
let's get into it. Pat has an awesome magnifier. He just does. He bought, I think it's a Vortex. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a Vortex. And it's funny because, we're starting off saying like it's an awesome magnifier. So it's a really nice piece of glass, but it's also only, air quotes, a $400 optic. And so in the spectrum of real steel optics, it's actually on the lower end. Although the reviews and stuff were really, really good. And I definitely think it's a very, very nice optic. So I think part of what we're going to get into here is, what do you actually get for your money when you're buying an airsoft optic versus a real steel one? And maybe is the price difference important when you're thinking about stuff?
Yeah, and to be very frank, like we've used magnifiers in the past, like we've used the flip down magnifiers, we've used really high powered airsoft, I would say, or replica magnifiers, like loophole replicas and stuff that are like, 10x or whatever. And we've used like the LCAN Spectres. And admittedly, like the LCAN Spectre was probably, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think is the best airsoft replica magnifier that I used anyway. And it is still real shitty compared to the Vortex, right?
Yeah, it's simultaneously got an interesting pairing of being absolutely the best airsoft optic I've owned is a $200 LCAN Spectre replica that had pretty okay eye relief. You couldn't really use the 1x to 4x switch because it didn't hold 0 if you did, and that's fairly common for airsoft optics, but it worked well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or at least better than anything else we'd used at the time. The $100-ish Leopold replica, demonstrated, I think, to us that one, you don't have any use for a 10x magnifier on an airsoft gun. Definitely. It's fun to look down, I'm sure, and I can say that having put it on my my rifle and used it for a while, but effective, no, not so much. Part of that is that at this point, I'm pretty convinced that for things other than like attempting to use them as a reconnaissance tool. Anything more than a 4x zoom is probably going to be outside of your needs for airsoft.
Yeah.
My HPA setup with the M27 is pretty heavily accurized at this point. I suspect you could tweak it a little bit higher to get some more range out of it if you put in the time and effort. And over the next couple of years, I may do that. But we're at the point where it's like, all right, so I guess we're gonna go replace the inner barrel with the 6.01. Try that out. Maybe shim the barrel. But these are things that are giving increasingly fine increments of benefit. And at its current effective range, which is definitely like pushing the 200 feet mark.
Absolutely.
Like comfortably. Possibly it's pushing further out than that, but like I certainly am very comfortable just sort of, that if I pull the trigger and I'm aiming at someone 200 feet away, I'll hit them. On 4X, I definitely don't lose any situational awareness, but I also can see the BB hitting people very comfortably at that range. So I don't think a higher magnification would be super useful. What is fantastic, at least from my point of view, about that optic is, I think this is probably the biggest thing. The glass is crystal clear and the eye relief is excellent. So there's a lot less fiddling in terms of getting used to shouldering it and getting your sight picture up.
Yeah.
Relative to even, like we said, the Alcan Spectre, which was the best of those. Like you still had to fidget around with it. It wasn't really easy to train in getting it up on good sight picture every time. Like I put a fair amount of work into that and it was still iffy because just the sight picture on it's not that good.
Yeah, and part of this conversation really was prompted by the fact that, the last game that we played together, I used Pat's, accurized HP that he's talking about, the M27, with that Vortex optic on it. And it was my first time actually using an airsoft replica with a magnifier on it in God knows how long, right? Probably the last time I used Jason Fong's gun randomly, right? And so
So it's been a couple of years.
Easily. I'd say even more than that. And consequently, I didn't really know what I was getting into, but one of the things I absolutely remember, and I often talk about how I shoot with both eyes open, right? And if you're shooting with both eyes open and one of your eyes is magnified, it does take a while to get used to. Now, thankfully, I've been doing this for years and years and years because of my photography stuff. I shoot with a zoomed in lens in one eye, right? Shooting like 75 millimeters or 100 millimeters or whatever in one eye, and I have my other eye open, right? And I don't need that for photography as much as I need it for airsoft, but that's just a habit that I picked up. But the consequence of that means...
There's a weird cross-compatibility of skills for you guys.
Well, yeah, and so when I brought your rifle up on target, what I'm used to doing in airsoft, or what I had done in the past, is having to sort of move my head around to make sure that I can get the proper sight picture with the magnified optic, and I did not have to do that. The rifle came up, and I got a sight picture right away, and it's like, oh, I'm seeing what I'm supposed to see. So
it doesn't take you that extra half a second every time you raise the rifle, and that is a big deal in airsoft.
Well, yeah, and I didn't even realize it immediately. Like I just sort of brought it up and it did the thing, and I was like, wait a minute, hey, hang on a second here. Like I'm not having to do anything, right? And that's why when I came off the field, I was like, this feels like cheating, because it really, what it allowed me to do, and I don't think I had it on 4X when I was shooting during that game. I think I had it probably on 2 power or something like that, which was still plenty. But
I mostly have found myself using it on like 2.5.
Yeah.
I guess the caveat for me is, so I do pop it down to, it has a 1x as its minimum, and I do pop it down to that when we're doing anything resembling like closer quarters, because having any magnification in like even like the relatively CQB sort of environments on the field is actively detrimental.
Yeah. But so I ended up using your rifle for that game, and the game that we were on, for those who are familiar with the field, was, was a road game, which means that when you're starting at one end of the field, you can go into this little area, like protected area that's, got a like a chest high wall sort of deal that you can get behind. And from that position, you have a line of fire that is roughly 40 to 50 meters, right? So 120 to 150 feet. And you have a really good angle on the approach, which means that from that position, you can really effectively engage the other enemy team, assuming you have that kind of range, which, as it turned out with Pat's rifle, I did. And I do have that range with my rifle, not quite as effective as we've talked about in the past. I do have the range, but I don't have a magnifier. And that is the moment when I realized, yes, a magnifier can be useful in airsoft, because with the magnifier on, I was able to very clearly see where my BBs were going relative to the target that I was shooting at. And if I was missing the target, which I absolutely was, I was able to compensate for that very easily. It is much, much harder to do that when your BB is so far away from you that you can't see it anymore. Right?
Yeah, so it does provide, that active benefit. One of the things I also find about it, although, I don't think this is a gameplay benefit so much as it is a, commentary on the airsoft community benefit. So at like 2.5 or 4x, I can definitely tell if my, rounds are hitting or missing somebody. And people flinch the same, whether they're getting hit or whether or not they're getting missed very narrowly for the most part. So, I am not particularly inclined to suggest that people are cheating, but this makes it very easy for me to go, oh yeah, no, like my shots are just wide. And then to compensate for that appropriately. But yeah, in practical terms, I have spent a fair amount of the last 5 years of my airsoft career playing a fairly long-ranged game when and where I can. And the magnified optics definitely useful for that, just in the sense that, you can go, oh yeah, I'm off by a foot and adjust, and then hit the person on the next shot. So it definitely requires less volume of fire at range to get effective hits on target. Now, that's not, no volume of fire, because out at 150 feet, 200 feet, or beyond, you're in a situation where, especially if you live in Newfoundland, the wind is distinctly affecting your shots.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
I'm not here suggesting that this is going to get you first round hits every time or anything, but it makes you more effective if you're playing at that range. And, one of the benefits here is the setup I have can do that. And, being one of the people Phil was shooting at that game, there are definitely points where I was going, oh yeah, I don't realize, or I didn't realize I was getting shot at by Phil, because I didn't realize he was close enough to be shooting at me effectively. And, he missed me the first round, missed me the second round, and then I was in cover. But like, that's not ineffective. That's taking a player out of being able to push up. And during that game, I was running a light machine gun and was spear tipping the push pretty hard.
Yeah, and fundamentally, like, if I'd been a better shot, more accustomed with the rifle, maybe I would have made that shot, right? But I think
definitely. I mean, it's also not as zeroed as it could be in point of fact, or at least it wasn't when you were playing it.
Right. And bottom line, right, what I'm getting at with this is, so I'm in this situation where I have a rifle that can, shoot out that far, and I've got the optic that enables me to maximize my effectiveness with that range. And that's when it sort of really clicked for me, like, okay, so if you have this whole system and the situation in the game really supports it, then it's very, very strong, or it can be very strong. Just a couple of, it wasn't perfect. Trying to shoot offside was very challenging with it. I was not able to.
Trying to shoot offside with a magnified optic is definitely, at least for me so far, this is a skill I'm working on acquiring and I'm getting better at. But it is substantially more work intensive than learning to shoot offside with a red dot.
And your rifle is also substantially longer than mine, owing to the suppressor on the front. So it was a little bit harder for me to manipulate it or get accustomed to manipulating it. I got there in the end, but fundamentally, that was the first time in my life that I have used an airsoft rifle with a magnifier on it and been like, wow, this is extremely effective. I see why people want to have this kind of setup, because it's so effective. And like I said to you, when I came off the field, it definitely felt like cheating, because I was in cover. I had a very good vantage field I had a very good field of view, right? I had a very good vantage. And people were coming out of cover and I could see like their head and the side of their body. And I was putting like one or two BBs and I was hitting them, right? And it was just over and over and over. So I had 3 lives and I got killed and got tagged out of the game completely. But with those 3 lives, I don't know how many players I took out. It's probably like in the order of like 12, maybe 15. I don't know. Because there are tons of players on the road. And I was able to hit them and their BBs were floating into me and I just get back in cover, right? And just, I could see the BBs floating in towards me, just duck and cover, pop, 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 pop against the wood, or have them fly through the window that I was shooting at, and I'm coming back out. Again, my rifle's up, ready to engage. I have my ready up. I'm looking down range with both eyes open so I know where my dot, or not my dot, I should say, my reticle is going to be, my crosshair. And I'm coming out, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a guy, bang. Like it was just really, really good.
The sort of, drawback, of course, is that this is both a pretty expensive gun in terms of build and a pretty expensive optic. So, we're probably talking about a fairly price-intensive mode of optimizing this way of play. That being said, I think if you're running, a moderately optimized bolt action, you can get mileage out of even an airsoft optic. My experience with airsoft optics has definitely been that the higher the power of magnification, the worse it typically is in terms of manufacturing quality. And I think that probably comes down to just doing high magnification nicely requires actually well-made pieces of glass, and you're not getting those in a $50 or $100 scope.
Well, I mean, there's a reason that camera lenses are like, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Good lenses are expensive to make. Right. Yeah, and so if you're just taking a concave or convex piece of glass and just slapping it in a plastic housing, it's probably not going to do the trick, bud.
Yeah, definitely. And so this is one of those pieces where I definitely feel like the real steel optic was a really good buy for me. But also it's, one of the more expensive things I've bought for airsoft that isn't an airsoft gun. Actually, it's the most expensive thing I've bought for airsoft that isn't an airsoft gun. And I, remember talking to you when I was picking it up and sort of talking about the fact that I felt this was a cool experiment. So it's nice to see positive outcomes there. I definitely also do really like the fact that when I bump it back to 1x, it's just a very effective optic. It's not quite even at 1x as fast as a red dot, but the amount of speed that I lose is not enough to really be crippling. If I at some point have more money that I'm willing to spend in a silly fashion on this particular build, I might buy some sort of reflex sight for the top of it. But my experience with those for airsoft has also been that the airsoft reflex red dots aren't sufficiently adjustable to deal with being high up on an optic, so stacked on top of another optic like the scope is. So that would probably be some sort of cheaper real steel red dot, and I might not do that because that sounds crazy as I talk about it, even by my liberal standards.
And I mean, like, from my standpoint too, like I had a really, really positive experience with that particular optic. And does that mean that I'm going to run out and buy one? Like, no. And even if I had the money, would I buy one? I mean, I'm not sure that I would. And part of the reason was that in this particular circumstance, in this particular game, in the position that I was in, with the game mode that we were playing, it was extremely effective. However, there's a couple of considerations. Obviously, we're not always going to be playing that game mode. I will not always be on that side, right? That's number one. Number two, I don't necessarily want to do that all the time, right? Like, we talked before how, Pat, like, you're more interested, or you have found yourself more interested in the last little while, being sort of more in the rear with the gear, so to speak. In this case, we're talking literal, gear, like your magnified optic. But that's sort of the game style that you have preferred, the play style that you have preferred. Whereas for myself, while that was fun to do one time, later on that day, I found myself like attacking from the front on the D-Day field, and a magnified optic of any sort is completely useless to me when the people that I'm shooting at are literally 15 meters ahead of me.
Yeah, it's
right?
definitely redundant in some of our options out there.
Right. And so
One
we
of the
had this conversation a while ago too, when I was, if you remember, I was on D-Day and I was shooting really far. And it's like, is it worth me bumping up the class of my rifle to like a DMR, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, so that on one particular game type, I can do a little bit better? Or am I fine with a reasonably functioning rifle? Am I fine with my rifle where I can play on every single field and just know when I need to bump myself up, by 10 meters, right?
and I
And
think
I think
that
it's the same principle.
yeah, I mean, I think that principle applies, but to that end, to that end, it becomes sort of a, well, how do you want to play airsoft, right?
Absolutely.
So like the same weekend I was running the moderately functional now M249. Still haven't HP'd it, but like it's doing pretty well as a relatively unupgraded internally AEG, and that's the first time in years, other than using the Garand, that I've used an AEG without any kind of optic on it. And I was sort of walking my rounds in because it's an LMG and it can do that. And I was surprised at how effective just like, there are people over there, I'll shoot in that direction, but I'll shoot a bunch was. So I'm definitely not walking away from that day of play or any other one lately going, you absolutely need to go buy a $400 optic. Like, that's not the takeaway here.
No, definitely.
I do think the takeaway is probably, if you're going to invest in trying to build a long range setup and you want to play a DMR or sniper kind of role, then probably some sort of reasonably decent optic that is not made for airsoft use might be a good idea. The distinction price point wise between like the G&G Elcan, I think was 200 when I bought it, and it might be a little bit more now because that was a while ago. I also think I might have gotten a discount on it at the time because I was doing some tech work from the store I bought it from. So yeah, like you're looking at 250 CAD for that. You're looking at 420, I think, for the Vortex that I have. That probably starts to be save the extra $150 and buy something that's not junk. If you're looking at doing that, if you're looking at putting, $1,000 into highly accurizing your airsoft bolt action sniper rifle, I think there's a point in that build process where having a good optic is actually going to be more important than some of the stuff you're doing. Which is weird to say as a gun tech, but I do really feel like if you're trying to play a really like long range standoff game of airsoft, there's value there. And at the outside edges of the gun's effective range, currently I'm definitely taking, 10 or 15 shots to hit somebody, but I'm also doing that at probably the 250, 275 foot mark. I haven't gone and measured the corner to corner distance. That's the furthest way I know I've hit someone off the top of my head. But that feels pretty good and is definitely a thing that wouldn't be feasible with a red dot, simply because at that range, I don't necessarily know where my BBs are going enough to correct without it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I had said, a while ago, and I've said it multiple times, that it's a mistake to use a magnifier for airsoft. I'm not going to say that I'm wrong about that. I still think that for probably the majority of airsofters, a 4x magnifier is overkill. And even for myself, in the situation that I found myself in, a couple weeks ago when we played, several weeks ago now when we played that game, I still think that a 4x magnifier was not necessary. I was doing fine on like 2 or 2.5 or whatever we had it set on. And like you said yourself, most of the time you're shooting at 2.5 anyway. 4x is really not providing that much benefit. But more importantly than that, the average person who is listening to this podcast, or even the average airsofter who is not listening to this podcast, their rifle is going to be outshot, so to speak, by a precision optic like the one that you have at 4x. It will not be able to deliver the type of accuracy that the scope is capable of providing to you. Right?
Totally. I mean,
if you're spending $400 on an optic there's probably another $400 that needs to come before you spend that $400 to be able to make use of it, right?
100%. The play order, if you will, is definitely critical here. So if you have a $200 raider and you're listening to this and thinking, oh, I'm going to go buy a $400 optic and put it on my $200 raider, the thing that's going to allow you to do is watch your BBs not hit your target.
Yeah. But I'd say that's true for a lot of rifles. Even it doesn't have to be a Raider. Like the Raider is the most basic one. But you want to take any sort of like, even a Crytac or something like that. Like, is that going to be able to deliver the accuracy that you want at the range that you want and make the maximum use of a $400 magnified optic? I would be highly suspicious.
Yeah, I agree. One of the truths of airsoft is that, yeah, you might get that one that came out of the factory and just all the tolerances happen to be perfect, in which case, great. Especially you might get that on a bolt action and get the value out of it. But really, in order to build something that can put, I'm using 0.32s on an airhop in a good barrel with a, at this point, relatively upgraded HPA system. So you're going to need to put some work into whatever you're using in order to get that range, right? Like if you just go buy a SEMA SVD, it's not going to work well. It doesn't need a $400 optic. You can probably dial it up to the point where, hey, yeah, that might actually be an okay idea. And in doing so, you're going to start to figure out whether or not you really like playing, at that range increment. Because one of the things I can definitely say is I've played a lot of games in that sort of like marksman, second and a half line position where I'm providing, good accurate fire to allow Phil and my other teammates to move up. And so for me, it was sort of like I really would like to all in this a bit more. Have the money. I'm going to order the optic. That's a mixture of me having disposable income and me being fairly sure that this wasn't going to be a thing I hated. Mm-hmm. Right. Ultimately, my situation was that I was pretty sure that it was going to result directly in me having an optic that I could dial back to one that would be useful when we were in close and that would do the other work that I needed it to do. And I still was iffy about spending the $400. I don't really regret it at this point, but it was also 2 years ago. So like I've forgotten that money ever existed.
Yep.
The takeaway I definitely would give is if you're in that role and you're using a cheaper optic, save up and get a better one. Like if it's a thing you're doing a lot and you like doing it, yeah, this is definitely worthwhile. If you are playing, in sort of a more rifleman role, probably not. And if you're thinking about sort of transitioning from a rifleman role to more of a marksman role, then make sure you do your due diligence. Make sure you upgrade your rifle and get it dialed in, whether you're using HPA or an AEG, get it dialed in really well so that it is accurate enough to get benefit out of that before you spend the money, because it's certainly going to end up being a waste if you are using it with something that can't match the performance.
Yeah,
also, big shout out to Chris who got me some Lexan protectors to go over the forward piece of the glass to protect it. For the love of God, do not take a $400 optic to an airsoft game without something to protect the front lens. It'll get shot out and you'll be out $400 and you'll be sad and or angry.
A Lexan protector is a great option. There's often, you could get kill flashes as well. Kill flashes are great because not only do they protect the lens from the BB, but they also prevent like glare or reduce glare, which is really good for, camouflaging, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you're planning on utilizing the optic in more of a sniper role, so using like some sort of scrim and ghillie and stuff, you definitely want some sort of kill flash. That will be very helpful. But I really have to echo a lot of Pat's sentiments here and, chime in with some of my own from the standpoint of someone who really has never particularly enjoyed the long range game, right? It's not that I don't enjoy being able to hit targets at a longer range. I definitely do, especially if they're shooting at me and I can't shoot them back. Like that kind of sucks. But one of the things that I definitely felt when I was engaging targets at longer ranges and I knew they couldn't hit me is it didn't it to me it didn't feel very fair, but it also didn't feel particularly like thrilling. Do you know what I mean? If you hit someone and there was basically no chance that they were going to hit you, from my perspective, I'm going like, okay, that's fine. Like I'm doing whatever I need to on the field. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm being effective, but I'm like, that is not doing the fun for me. This is not giving me serotonins, right? Winning the game is all fine and dandy, but you guys will know by the conversations that we've had, what I enjoy from airsoft is pushing myself to be better, right? Trying to get more proficient at what we do, etc. And if I don't feel challenged by what I'm doing, that gets stale very, very quickly. So in this particular case, that was fun. But if I did this game after game after game, I would have to find new ways of potentially challenging myself, and maybe I would find them. But I find it's a lot easier to challenge myself when I'm constantly getting hit out by other players because I'm stupid and doing stupid things on the field, and then being punished for it, and then trying to learn from those mistakes and grow in that way, right?
I've certainly, had some experience playing where especially recently using the LMG, where I'm like, yeah, no, this reminds me how much fun like pushing up and sort of playing more of a door kicker role can be. But I have to admit that I am definitely a little bit of a when I shoot people at ranges where they can't effectively engage me.
Totally.
There's enjoyment there. Also, we play enough games at sort of like mid-range distances where the range I have is useful, but not, practically speaking, dominant, if you will, where it's like, figuring out the ways to play around and use and effectively function with the kit I've got is definitely also fun. And like I can definitely see your point in the sense that, to reference back to what you said, it feels like cheating, right? But to use a phrase that I jokingly use a lot when playing tabletop war games, yeah, but it's legal cheating, which is the best kind.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, like that's how I feel about it. That's not how everyone else is going to feel, and that's totally okay. Again, it comes down to your preference, right? What you're going to enjoy doing on the field, what you find is fun, what engages you, right? And for me, that was fun, but not necessarily something I want to repeat every single game. Whereas other people will find that, and I know Mark used to love doing that, Jason used to love doing that, you're enjoying it very much, and that's great. So really it comes down to whatever your preference is. But fundamentally, I just want to acknowledge that when I had said previously that, 4x magnifier in airsoft is completely useless, I don't think that was on side at all. I think there's definitely some use cases, and I was witness to some of it when we played that game. And I can certainly see if people played on a different field or in different places, for example, where the forest is a lot thinner and you actually have really long fire lanes, can be really, really useful. But I think it's best left for people who enjoy it more than I do, let's say.
And I think it's good to acknowledge that, like, not every use case is the one we play in, but also, we've been doing this for a while, we old, and still, we try new gear and it's like, oh, yeah, okay, that works. I mean, the same game was sort of a like, oh yeah, okay, LMGs can be effective. Like, it is possible to dial these in a lot better than we thought. Yeah. And that has value. Cool.
And I think, the idea of changing your mind should not be a dirty thought.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Like, you should be able to say, like, oh, I believe this is the case right now, and then operate under that way, and then be shown something new and go, oh, I'm changing my mind because, and I mean, this would be the case for every new piece of gear that we've used and have loved. I mean, whether it's your 2-point slings, whether it's your, Chicom chest rigs, who you are, thank you. Whether it's AK-47s and never having used them and finding them really useful, thanks, Stefan. Like, those are all ways that you can try new things and change your opinion. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go full bore the other way either, but you can just acknowledge that, hey, you know what? My opinion has changed since the last time, and I think that's definitely been the case, but it was changed because the basis on which I had made my previous opinion was based on the information that we had at the time, which was not very good glass. And when you upgrade the glass, it makes a huge difference. And as well, I mean, taking the time to invest into a piece of kit that is meant to be used the way that we're using it, meant to hold zero. It's not just a toy, it's not just a replica, it's actually something that people are going to use in the quote unquote real world, will make a really, really big difference when it's such a mission critical piece of kit, especially if you're engaging targets at a longer range like that.
Definitely. In related news today, teacher advocates learning.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's good to change your mind, right? Or it's good to at least be willing to address your kit and poke it and think, oh, can we do stuff like this? And I mean, in this case, I'm flat out admitting that this is a really expensive piece of kit and that no human being who is sensible needs it to play airsoft.
Definitely.
But I will definitely also argue, yeah, it can be effective. I'll note for anyone who's like me and kind of likes impression kits, never ever buy a airsoft ACOG. The eye relief is roughly the lens needs to be touching your eyeball, which is difficult when you have goggles on. But you can get red dot ones that are just a red dot, and that's definitely the way to go with those. A little piece of advice from one of my previous kit builds.
Fair enough. Well, listen, guys, that's really all we have to say about optics. I'm glad you tuned in to listen to us ramble about how much how our opinions have changed over the years. Our next podcast episode is episode 100. It's very hard for me to believe that we've stuck with this so long. We've done over 2 years now between breaks and so on of podcasts. We started the podcast back in September of 2020, if you can believe that. So next episode, we're going to have a special 100th celebration episode. But until then, we look forward to speaking to you. If you are not a member of our Discord community, the link is in the description. Please join. I'm tired of telling you to join. Join the community, subscribe to our YouTube page, and that's all we've got for you this week. We will talk to you next week.
Join the Discord, or Phil will let me have a air horn soundboard for our 100th episode.
Yeah.
Have a good week, guys.
Take care.